Welcome to Independently Speaking, the new podcast of the Independent Schools Association. Celebrating our diversity, we take pride in representing a broad spectrum of educational settings, including nursery, preparatory, senior, sixth form, and boarding schools. This vibrant network includes institutions specializing in the arts, sports, and faith-based education, along with those offering exceptional assistance for students with special educational needs or disabilities. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Independently Speaking. Now here is your host, ISA Director of Education and Inclusion, Helen Stanton-Tonner.
Welcome once again to the ISA podcast, Independently Speaking. I am your host, Helen Stanton-Tonner, the Director of Education and Inclusion for ISA. And today's episode is the last one in this series that has been focusing on supporting the mental health and well-being of our students and staff. But within this episode, we are focusing on some of our most vulnerable students, those with special educational needs. Joining me are two experts in their field. Michelle Catterson, the head of Moon Hall, a specialist dyslexia school based in Surrey and chair of the British Dyslexia Association. She is a passionate educator who believes that all children, despite their SEN needs, are entitled to an education suited to their abilities. She is also a strong advocate and voice for the sector. Also joining us is Christine Cunniffe, the school principal of LVS Ascot, which educates boys and girls from the ages of 4 to 19. Christine has become a respected voice in the sector of education, appearing on both television and radio, as well as being a published author. Thank you, Michelle and Christine, for joining us on the ISA podcast. It's really great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us. Thank you.
Yeah, really excited to be discussing the topic today with you. So thank you so much for the invite.
You're more than welcome. Now, obviously, with your both being very experienced within special educational needs and disabilities, with your background and with the schools and the work that you do, have you, either of you, noticed that any unique mental health challenges faced by students with special educational needs and disabilities within settings that you've worked in?
I think generally young people are quite anxious. I think all pupils are at the moment, and the world's a very different place, isn't it? So, I think it's just their general, for my school, which is a mainstream school, it's just ensuring that we've got the right provision in the right place for them, and making sure that if there are any needs, that we identify them as soon as possible. Because sometimes when we have children coming from other schools, it's not always apparent. It might not be picked up in other schools as well. So, I think that's our priority, to make sure that children stay happy and understand that, happiness can lead to good learning outcomes, and that we've got to provide the right tools for children to be able to access the curriculum and do the best that they can.
Michelle, do you get the same sort of information or feedback from your students and staff as well for that?
Yeah, so my school is a mainstream specialist school. So all the students at my school have a diagnosis of special educational needs, primarily dyslexia. And I think what we know in terms of research is that children with SEN are at a much higher risk of mental health illness. They're at a much higher risk of self-harm and a much higher risk of suicide ideation. And I know that sounds really frightening and quite horrific, but sadly that's the reality of the situation, that children with SEN are quite vulnerable. All children have the capacity to be very vulnerable, and all children react to situations in very different ways, which is absolutely fine. But we have to be aware that children with SEN may struggle with communication, or they may communicate in a different way from actual emotions that they're feeling. And I think anybody who's working with children with SEN needs to be quite clear on that, and be able to signpost the children and the families when there are mental health issues that they're dealing with at that point in time.
And obviously effective identification is vital. How do you go about that, particularly when you're dealing with such vulnerable students who may be portraying many complex issues and challenges within their daily life? How do you effectively identify where mental health becomes a bigger challenge for them?
So I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because children with SEN don't always present in a typical way. So if you take a child with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, those are the children that quite often can be perceived as naughty or not concentrating or not sitting still. And you notice those behaviours. You're not really looking at the core of, well, why are they behaving like that in the first instance? And I think that's what we've got to remind ourselves, is that all behaviour is a result of an emotion. Sometimes children get overwhelmed, and that's children even without SEN, and they can find processing information really challenging, and situations can become really difficult for them to contemplate. And I think it's an awareness of all educators that we need to look out for these children. We need to look out for them, and differentiating between their SEN needs and any other needs is exceptionally challenging. There's not enough training for teachers in their teacher training about SEN, how to identify, what strategies to use. I think it's a big loss when we don't include that for all these new teachers that are qualifying. And that should definitely be something that's addressed, because teachers want to help. They want to do their best. But if they're not armed with the resources and the knowledge, which gives them power to be able to do that, then they're not going to be in the best position to be able to support.
And Christine, does this lead, do you think, to sort of common misconceptions and misunderstanding of what the students are going through?
Yeah, and I think because our biggest intake is into year 7 as well, so the transition into secondary school is always a big one anyway, and there might have been something that hadn't been picked up, and we do see that. We're a school that can cater for mild learning needs, and sometimes those needs are not apparent till they come to secondary school. And the other thing that we find is, because we have children from all over the world, is that you might have children where English is their second language as well, and therefore we think that the issues are with learning English when they start to manifest themselves that there's probably a learning need in there as well, which hasn't been picked up before, which we then need to be able to communicate with the children and find out what is actually going on. And that can be really complex. Sometimes we won't see a problem on an application form, but when the children come to us, we see that there are some needs there that we need to uncover and make sure we've got the provision in the right place. And interesting what Michelle said, because I've been to see Michelle in her school, which is absolutely amazing, which is fully inclusive. And she said to me, we don't bring anybody out on one-to-one. We had that conversation, and that her teachers are trained to a high level. I think what we're trying to achieve at LVS with the small class sizes is that teachers training to bring the skill set up so that this education can be more inclusive and ready to tackle complex needs.
Yeah, and that inclusivity is vital, isn't it? In order, across, regardless of setting, or whether what Michelle, what you do is incredibly inclusive in the way that you do incorporate everything for every student. But the way that your school is designed wouldn't necessarily work for other schools in the same format. So how can we make sure that these services are really accessible for students? So it's not always the staff who have to instigate what the need may be, to allow the students to have the confidence to know that these facilities are accessible to them and they can access them.
So I've worked in state, I've worked in independent, I've worked in mainstream, and now in specialist. And I think each school has to have their own unique way of dealing with it based on the cohort of children that you have. The one thing that I would say is really empowering for students is to remove the stigma where possible. So even simple things like assemblies on specific neurodiversity, so that there's better awareness and understanding amongst peer groups. The CPD offer that's available to staff is really key, and that doesn't need to be expensive courses and training. Yes, at my school, my staff have to do additional training in literacy, and they've got level 5, level 7 qualifications. But even as a team in most schools, you're going to have an absolute wealth of knowledge and expertise within your staff. But there's also so many schools that would happily lend some of their staff to do different things that they're maybe not experts in. And I think that's what's great about the ISA, is that the membership organisation, we really do share the strengths of one another. And what I would say is what Christine does at LVS is fantastic. She really does help that whole inclusive environment, which is just so important. And I know we talk about inclusivity and you expect most schools to do it, but they don't. And Christine's school does it exceptionally well. I think that whole awareness, the staff training and parent training as well, because for a parent, not even training for parents, but just awareness for parents, sometimes they'll maybe even approach us and say, like, there's just something, I can't quite put my finger on it, I'm not sure what it is, and they need guidance and support, and not even just to the point of diagnosis. When they get that diagnosis, it can be a bit of a relief, but it can also be a bit of a fear and a panic as to, oh my goodness, what do I do next, and what support can I get in place? So it really has to be a joined up approach in your school community.
And Christine, within your setting, how have you accomplished that? How have you managed to empower your staff and to put in such an inclusive and a way of dealing with all of these different issues? What journey did you go on to get to where you are?
I think one thing is really vital is to talk about it, and to talk about it openly as well. And we have a brilliant head of neurodiversity, and so we made it sort of like it's a really broad spectrum, and I say, come on guys, if there's 20 of us in the room, X number of us are going to have this, X number are going to have that, etc. Everybody has a unique learning way of learning, without a doubt. And I think as we get older, we know that we have those unique ways of learning as well. So it's a very broad spectrum. So I think the more we talk about it, the more we talk about unique ways of learning, personalization, using technology for blended learning, we talk about it. So therefore there is no stigma, there is no labeling. And I know sometimes some parents, especially now we've changed our provision as well, thanks to some help from Michelle as well, is that parents feel that if they're having the one-to-one lessons or they've got a certain amount of LSA support, it kind of ticks that box and everything's going to be okay. And that's not the answer. It's not necessarily the best provision. An inclusive talking environment where we share our concerns and we share our expertise makes a very successful environment.
So it's keeping everything out in the open, isn't it? And being very honest. I mean, you both mentioned parents, and obviously you can't work with children without working with the families that surround them. We're all very much around that. And how do we really incorporate those parents? I mean, Michelle, you mentioned a little bit about almost like supporting them and giving them advice, and Christine, you talked about being open and honest. But what kind of strategies would you advise other schools to use to really get the parents involved with it?
So we run webinars for parents. We do activities in the school where the parents can come in and just have a cup of coffee and a chat with the SENCO. I think it's when you've got a parent who's got a child with SEN, they've been on this quite traumatic journey sometimes, quite horrifically traumatic sometimes, either not being believed or the school not supporting, or stigma around it with family members, their child not wanting to go to school. So it's been such a challenge for these parents. And sometimes because they've had to fight so much to advocate for their child, it can be difficult for them to know when it's okay and you don't need to fight anymore and we're on your side. And I think when parents do get to Moon Hall, quite often you can even see it as transformational for the family, not just for the child, and they feel understood. And it's just so important. And I think making the parents recognise and place the trust in the school is really key, that they understand that we are going to look after your child. We're going to do our absolute best to make sure that their needs are met. And that doesn't come automatically. It does for some. For some parents, you need to work a little bit more closely with them. And I think as head teacher, that's really paid off for us, is finding those parents that might need that little bit more support or a little bit more guidance. We have 70% of our students have an EHCP. For some of those families, we do a pre-annual review meeting so that we're not just turning up to the meeting together and discussing things that the parent has no idea what's happening. So we might sit down with that parent. You've got to also remember that there's a hereditary link with a lot of SEN, and the parents may also have dyslexia, for example, in my school. So presenting them with loads of paperwork and lots of information in writing. So I think you've got to make those accommodations for parents, get them on board, get them to trust you, and get them involved as much as you possibly can.
And do you find that, obviously you're talking about that point when you actually say to the parents, like, we've got you, we're supporting you, you don't have to fight anymore. And if the students are kind of settled in and then maybe later down the road have a mental health crisis, or obviously need some support in mental health, does that then make it easier to involve the parents in that because you've already got that relationship?
Yeah, I think so. And listening to Michelle, which is really interesting, I'm sort of like just backtracking a little bit, because as you say, Michelle, when most of the children that you have the EHCP, so therefore that fight, as you say, is kind of over and you start a new journey. With mine, it's not the case. It could be a complete starting point. So therefore, that's where the fight starts. And it could be also that parents have probably intuitively realised there's something wrong. But as you say, it's normally hereditary. So therefore, there could be a barrier there. And maybe because a parent's struggled, they don't want to acknowledge that maybe their child is struggling too. So we have to start those conversations, which can be really tricky as well. So what we try and do is get to that point before any mental health issues manifest themselves, because without a doubt, if it's not addressed and there's intervention from, as soon as possible, those issues can arise, if not when they're in school, but later on in life when they go out to university or into the workplace, which you can see with older adults.
One of the things, and I think most of us in education are aware of, is those children that will mask at school and not necessarily share, which makes it even more difficult for our sort of pastoral leads and our safeguarding leads to identify those children, but girls in particular. So we quite often find that children will come to Moonhall with their primary need as dyslexia, and then it's not until year 9, year 10 that actually we pick up on some of those autistic traits, because it's starting to get a little bit more intense with the education and the exams, and that's when in particular our girls kind of fall apart a little bit sometimes, where they really need that pastoral support. So for us, it's about getting in there before it gets to that crisis moment, but it's really challenging. Teenagers have to deal with a lot more than we had to deal with as teenagers, and I understand why they find it difficult.
Yeah, absolutely, they do. And one of the areas they have to deal with that maybe we didn't when we were there is the use of technology and the impact that technology has on their everyday lives, and the fact that it's always on. Do you find that with your students, those with special educational needs, do you find that they find that more challenging, or is it harder for them to navigate the digital world? Does it have a bigger impact on them?
I think it's quite difficult to say. I mean, one thing that I think does go on is that yourself, if you feel that you don't identify or can't understand how you're working, or your own complex needs, you may search for those traits. You may search for that online. And I think that could be probably a little bit dangerous, because we all know how algorithms work and how that can lead children down the wrong avenues, and that can be an absolute disaster. I mean, I'd like to think that technology is a positive thing for personalised learning and helping those children. I think the onset of AI and what's happening now can only be a good thing for inclusivity, but obviously there's always going to be that dark side.
Michelle, do you see any particularly vulnerable traits through your students through the use of technology?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, and just as Christine said, I'm a huge fan of AI and assistive technology. I really think it's the leveler for children with SEN, and it gives them that access to education. But we advocate for it with caution, because of the safeguarding risks. And I think I have dealt with some safeguarding issues where some of my students, because they're very vulnerable, because they're very trusting and believe stories, they have found themselves in very difficult potential grooming situations online, where they've thought that the adult that they were speaking to was a 12-year-old, the same age as them and the same interests as them. They very much see the best in individuals, and I don't mean to be disparaging of them at all. They're just lovely children, but they find it a challenge to I don't know, question and stand back and think, is this real? Is it a scam? Are they telling the truth? They take things very much on face value, which is a lovely thing and very admirable, but also doesn't always protect them. And I've had conversations with parents whose child has got into a bit of a sticky situation online, and they've said, like, they even as a very, very small child, they always worried about their son being the one at the park where somebody might use that typical old-fashioned story of, I've got some sweets in the van, or I've got some puppies in the, and they'd be lured in by that. And I don't think we experience it that way to that extent at our school. But I think we just need to be very aware of the trusting nature of children with SEN and to protect them as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. And Christine, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you were talking about how if interventions aren't put in place sort of early enough, it can actually affect them, a lot later, even sort of as sort of young and older adults. So what kind of best practices do you put in place to try and prepare your students with SEND for that transition to be successful, to move from school to further education or into employment? What kind of things do you put in place?
So we've got wellbeing packages and support as well, so that and school counsellors. But what we try and do is prepare children for that next step, because often children will go to university and the dropout rate can be quite high. And you also hear of the mental health issues that the children may have once they go to university. And I think only now are universities catching on to that, because there's been some very high profile stories where they're actually providing more pastoral support than they did before. But what I would say to parents is, as we get into the sixth form, some parents will ask for probably a little bit too much support because they're worried and they're afraid for that A level or the BTECs that they're doing, whereas it's not doing them any good, where we have to try and say, right, now you're of a certain age, you've got these coping techniques, you know how to navigate your world, your work, or whether that's with the assisted AI or whether that's just through, counselling, because the next step, you're not going to have this hand holding, and therefore you need to know what your support structure is going to be moving forward. So we have these open conversations, and it is tricky, because as parents, we want to make sure that our children are safe and handhold. We want to make sure that they've got as much as they can, but there's going to come a time when these young people are going to fly, and even if they have it through uni, they're going to go into the workplace. Now, I sometimes hear of issues that happen later on in adult life that come to a surprise to me, because I think in school, X was okay. What has happened here? And you look back on reflection, you go, there was something. And I think that experience now means that we are watching very closely. As Michelle said, high functioning autistic girls, for example, you don't see that coming until maybe issues happen in the sixth form or beyond. So I think we've got to be very aware. We've got to watch our pupils and question ourselves, is everything okay?
Michelle, do you do anything else in particular to prepare your students?
Yeah, I mean, I would say right from when they start at the school, especially in the senior school, we're preparing them for adulthood and life after Moonhall. And that begins in the classroom. So Christine sort of alluded to it a little bit. We're not taking the kids out of the lessons. Our teaching assistants are not sat down, attached to one individual child, doing the work for them. They're very much there as prompters and motivators and encouraging the children to tackle the tasks on their own. There's so much research about the over-reliance on other adults and teaching assistants. And as much as teaching assistants are absolutely fantastic and we couldn't do our job as teachers without them, they have to absolutely be used in the right way, in the best way in the classroom. So for us, even in the classroom, we're not allowing the children to look to the adult on how to do things. So the use of assistive tech is really important, dictation software and using speech to text software, all of those kind of things. We also have PSHE days where instead of having it as a weekly lesson throughout the timetable, every 6 weeks, so every half term, we have a full day dedicated to PSHE, and that has different themes that run throughout the year groups vertically as well. So as they go through the years, it'll become more in-depth topics. The last one that we did was on relationships. So we're talking about things that aren't necessarily related to the curriculum as such, and we're giving it a full spotlight on a dedicated day so that they can get as much out of it as possible.
That's great. This has been a really good discussion, actually. It's been you've given an awful lot of information and shared a great deal of your experience. And one of the key things that seem to have come through is the knowledge of your pupils, the real understanding of who they are, and the empowerment and training of your staff, as well as that communication with parents. It's almost like a threefold approach to support those students as they journey through your schools. If you were to give maybe a piece of advice for our listeners who may be sort of embarking on their headship journey, or maybe they're looking at reviewing their policies so they can support their students with SEND's mental health in the best way possible, what key advice would you give them?
I think to just to look carefully, look at the policies and procedures. So how inclusive are the policies and procedures? What is the current practice? And is it something that people have done? That's all, we've always done it like that. So surely that works now, because in the future that we have here, past successes are not a measure of future successes. So therefore, we have to look to the future and look at our young people and how we prepare them for the future.
Great advice. Thank you. Michelle?
I think look at other schools that are demonstrating good practice. Look at what their policies are like. Look at how inclusive they are. There's always parents that are great advocates for the school as well that will provide a testimonial or will chat to you about things. It's slightly different at my school, but look at the senior leadership team within schools. Is there a senior leader that's got responsibility for SEN? Is there a governor who's got responsibility for SEN? These are all sort of not necessities, but they're indicators that SEN and inclusivity is taken quite seriously within the school. If you have someone at management or senior level that's leading on it, look at the SEN department, how's it structured, look at the qualifications of the SEN department. It doesn't mean that you have to have all these fancy qualifications, but how committed are they? How much do they want to make a difference for those children that they're looking after? Can be very difficult to look at an inspection report or look at some policies and get an accurate measure of what the school's like. So go have a look and visit and see how much of it is tangible and you can absorb yourself.
Brilliant. Christine and Michelle, thank you so much for your advice and insights today. Really appreciated having you on the podcast. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been a really informative and insightful conversation. You've both been really open about your experiences and given us a great deal to take away in relation to supporting the pupils with SEND in our schools. Thank you so much for your input into this episode. To our audience, thank you again for tuning in to another episode of this ISA podcast series. We've now concluded this particular series on the importance of supporting mental health strategies and promoting resilience in our schools. But if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you subscribe to past and future episodes where we'll continue exploring crucial topics in education. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll be back soon with more insights and inspiration. Until next time.
You've been listening to Independently Speaking, the podcast of the Independent Schools Association. For more information about ISA and the schools we support, please visit isaschools.org.uk.